Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Integrate Professional Development webinar series. The Integrate project aims to promote faculty teaching about the Earth in the context of society. Integrate is an NSF-funded STEM talent expansion project. Its two overarching goals are first, to develop materials and curricula that are adoptable and adaptable for faculty to increase Earth literacy for all undergraduates, and second, to increase majors in the geosciences and related fields to develop a workforce capable of tackling environmental and resource challenges. This webinar is part of a series supporting teaching with Integrate principles using the piloted and peer-reviewed Integrate developed and curated materials as tools. On the screen and in the chat box, there's a link to our webinar event page where you can find the presentation slides, resources related to today's webinar, and afterwards a recording of the webinar. If you have questions along the way, we encourage you to enter those into the chat box. To find that, you'll need to locate the Zoom control bar and click on the chat button. We ask that you leave your microphone muted and video off. These will help us get a good recording of today's webinar. Today's webinar is also part of the NAGT On the Cutting Edge program webinar series. NAGT webinars feature novel and innovative work in Earth education, research and pedagogy, new teaching materials, and the classroom and professional experiences of people like you. Before we get started, I want to turn things over really quickly to Rory McFadden, who's going to say a couple of things for participants in today's webinar who are coming to our workshop in a couple of weeks.
Hi, everybody. I just wanted to say hello and thanks for coming and welcome everybody and thinking about the Earth Education for Sustainable Societies workshop. Just speaking on behalf of the workshop conveners. We look forward to seeing everyone at the workshop and appreciate people attending this webinar and the one from 2 weeks ago. Just a reminder, the workshop's the 14th to 16th of October. We have a diverse group of participants from all over the country, educators from K-12, from informal education, from higher education. And just one other thing for the workshop attendees, the essay contribution deadline is October 4th. So if you have some ideas for an essay to submit, you still have a few days to do that. All right, thanks a lot, Mitchell.
Thanks, Rory. All right, today our webinar is presented by Ann Egger and Kim Castens. They'll be presenting lessons learned from Integrate's materials development program and what remains undone. They'll be discussing the strategies that led to the development of Integrate's high quality resources that aligned with the project's guiding principles, the evaluation strategies, the scope of the materials, and lessons learned in the process. And at this point, I'll turn it over to Ann.
Thanks, Mitchell. Okay, yes, I am unmuted. And thanks everybody for coming today. We saw that a lot of you are already very familiar with Integrate, so we're not going to spend a lot of time talking about what the project is, but more about what came out of the project, and in particular today, out of the materials development program. Of course, that doesn't mean that we did everything. So I think from our perspective, we're going to talk a little bit about what also still is out there remaining to be done. Okay, so starting from some of our first principles here, what kinds of learning experiences will position students to make sustainable decisions in the future? So this was our sort of guiding big question in developing curricular materials. So we wanted curricular materials that address the challenges that society is facing, that use rigorous science, that engage all students in a variety of settings, so not just one type of college or one type of classroom, that make use of best practices in learning and really evidence-based practices in learning, and are adaptable and adoptable by instructors. So these are pretty big goals. So how did we ensure that all of those conditions were met in the materials that we developed? And I'll show you three big ways that happened. The first was in the design of the development teams. And these teams that developed the materials, many of you were authors or no authors. There were 3 to 5 authors who were also instructors. and they're from different institutions, often different disciplines and different kinds of institutions. And I'm going to show you sort of where we ended up with that in a minute. There was also an assessment consultant who was part of an assessment team, and the assessment team worked together with many different author teams. There was a web consultant from the web team, and the same idea there. And then there was a content area leader or an editor from the InTeGrate leadership team to kind of manage groups together. So from the very beginning, collaboration and consultation were built in, and that was built in to support authors who were also instructors and would be teaching with the materials in these different settings. So how do we do on that? Well, here's our type of distribution of authors from different types of institutions. So one of our goals was to make sure we had instructors from associates colleges or two-year colleges on every team, and that was largely true. And there's our geographic distribution. So we got pretty far across the United States, not quite every state, but that's also, you can get a sense for the higher population areas also being where we drew most of the instructors from. And our disciplinary distribution of authors also reached our goals of bringing geoscientists together with both other scientists and non-scientists in authoring the materials. So a few lessons learned about those teams and how we could support them best. So the first was that because they were working remotely with each other virtually all the time, that an initial face-to-face meeting was really critical to building a common vision and to building trust within the teams. In addition, to support that remote work plan, a really realistic communication plan that included regular meetings was critical to making progress and to keeping everyone on track. And finally, although we had a lot of ideas about how quickly or how easily these materials could be developed, we had to be flexible. The leadership had to be flexible and accommodating changes in teaching loads and academic schedules in life. You know, these were big investments of time that were tied to both professional and personal concerns. So we did have to keep that in mind on our side. The second big way that we ensured the curriculum materials supported our goals was that those goals were encoded in a rubric that the materials were assessed against. And the rubric had 6 components. The first is guiding principles. And you can see those at the top there. I know this is hard to read, you don't have to read them, but the idea is that those guiding principles were ingrained throughout the InTeGrate project, and here they were applied specifically to the curricular materials. And those had to be explicit and pervasive throughout the materials in order to pass the rubric. The remaining 5 areas, from learning objectives and outcomes all the way through alignment, these really emerged from evidence-based practices and curriculum design in general, where the guiding principles were more specific to the InTeGrate project. So all of these sections of the rubric had to be passed in order for the materials to be produced. So how do we do on that? So this is a complicated graph, not yet. Now it looks like there's a lot of white, but I'm going to just walk you through a few things that we saw. So at the top, you can see there were 3 cohorts of materials authors, and then you'll see their average rubric scores the first time their materials went through the rubric. So in the guiding principles, since those had to be explicit and pervasive throughout, in some ways those were the easiest to achieve, except you can see one was a little bit lower, and this was in systems thinking. But again, you can see that each cohort improved on that first score, and I'll get to why in my lessons learned in a moment. Learning outcomes, you can see some of the same patterns there, and the one that was very low the first time around was in the use of rubrics. So again, you could see some significant improvement from cohort 1 to 2 and 3 based on some of the things we implemented because of those scores. I'm just going to bring up the rest of that you don't need to look at all of this. Obviously, it's a lot of stuff, but you probably are drawn to this very low one, which is metacognition. And it's something that a lot of the author teams struggled with implementing into their materials. And those were some of the lower scores within those, the elements of the rubric. So in general, what we learned along the way through the use of the rubric was that the time spent developing that was very well spent, and it provided structure for more than just the curriculum development. In fact, what we were able to do is see these project-wide weaknesses, like using metacognitive strategies within the materials and systems thinking and using rubrics. We were able to see those very quickly by the initial rubric scores. And we addressed those in two ways. One was through professional development of the authors in that cohort one. We didn't just leave them hanging. But also we then structured future cohort workshops around the rubric itself, so that each face-to-face meeting had the agenda was built around the rubric. And we were able to structure webinars and professional development opportunities throughout based on those, the rubric itself. So this was an extremely useful and productive way to think about not only the materials, but supporting the authors. So then the third way we ensured the goals were met was through the supporting website. And some of you might think of the InTeGrate website as the project. But so really there's two components to what we're thinking of as the supporting website. One is the inward facing. That was really for materials developers and the leadership. And the other is outward facing, and that's largely what you would be familiar with as a participant. So the inward facing site had lots of detailed information for authors, and it provided a way, a means of accountability for individuals and teams. So there were reporting pages that allowed people to, or that had checkpoints within it, allowing them to report on their progress. There's an assessment system that's built in where authors could upload data. It would be anonymized and scored through this assessment system. And leaders, the team leaders and the web team could look at a glance, and the assessment team could see where all the teams were at any given point. So this was a really critical piece to keeping everybody on top of things. Of course, the outward facing site, that's where the materials went as they became available, where they go as they become available. There is a lot of information there about the InTeGrate philosophy and approach. And there's things like a teacher stash, which has answer keys that you need to register for. And there's also opportunities to get involved. A little bit more about that inward supporting website, because that, again, was really critical to the success of the project. This is a graphic showing a rough timeline. Of course, there's no actual time on it because it was a very flexible timeline, but it shows the steps that all of the materials and the authors had to check off and submit reports for. And it also, we have some sense of what kind of the access of that site from the author. So this is just number of page views, and each one of those spikes is associated with meetings of the authors and getting them using the site. So this was really a supporting resource, both into inward and outward. Sorry, I'm having trouble with my adjectives. So a few lessons learned about the website. Using this system that was built, custom built system, and also spent a lot of time developing that, it really had to be required to promote accountability and accuracy. And once that was another thing we learned through time. A lot of people wanted to use other systems or other ways of communicating, but this was the way that we had to, the only way that we had to kind of keep such a big project going and make sure we all knew what was going on. The web team support was also absolutely critical to maintaining consistency and high quality. And what you see on the web now is this represents a lot of teamwork with a huge amount of support from the web team. So here's what just a screenshot of what you do see now as a result. We have many modules and courses, and you can search them in many different ways. So this is what we have to show for that complex system that we put together for the materials development and some of the lessons that we learned from it. So I'm going to pause at this point and see if there are any questions. Getting the chat open here. And so feel free to type anything into, or comments or thoughts into the chat, and I'll just stop talking for a few minutes and see what comes in. Oh, that's a good, so are we looking to revise the rubric at the workshop, or do you like it as it is? I would not speak for the organizers of the workshop, but I think the rubric is a great, that it's a very good rubric. That doesn't mean it's not worth examining to see if those guiding principles are still the right ones, or if that's still what we would use moving forward if there were to be more materials developed. Kim, feel free to add anything.
Yeah, so the people who are coming to the workshop may have slightly different foci, and one example could be the people at GETSI who made a slight change in the rubric and changed one of the principles to better align with the content domain that they were working in. So there could very well be a group of people who will be coming to the workshop and working on materials development that has a slightly different set of ambitions that might want to tweak the rubric, but certainly there's a lot there to build on, and I would suggest starting with that rather than starting over again from scratch.
I agree. So then there are, and Kathy Manduka also responded similarly, and that what we have is well aligned with sustainability education. And there are two more questions. What are the additional plans for additional cohorts to develop additional materials, and how many professional development events did you hold to support authors? So the money for InTeGrate and for curriculum development is gone. So, but we do think we have a really good model for curriculum development that can be, and several projects, including GETSI, as was just mentioned, are using that same process. We're successful in getting funding to develop curriculum materials using it. So we do see that it's a really good path moving forward, or a good way to propose developing materials moving forward. And then, so professional development events is a big umbrella. For the authors, there were 2 in-person meetings, one when they just got started and one when they were, after they pilot tested their materials and were making revisions. But then there were all kinds of other events. There were workshops, there were webinars, there were online materials they could work through at their own pace. So they could really take advantage of as many of those as they wanted to, and they were, we added more all the time. Okay, so Kathy just mentioned Eddie is another project that's using a similar model. So Mitchell put that link as he's done with the GETSI materials.
Should I go on?
Over to you, Kim.
Okay, so I'm going to be talking about, my comments are really oriented towards somebody who might be coming to the workshop and would be hoping to create a materials development. And so my next set of comments have to do with how are you actually going to know if your materials development process or if your materials themselves are actually working. And the first piece of advice here is don't assume. Don't assume that just because it's logical that they should work, that they actually are working. As you know, the history of science is littered with examples of people who had good ideas that seemed like they should be true, but turned out not to be true, like our friend Lord Kelvin here, who had a really good physics-based line of reasoning for why the age of the Earth could not be more than several million years, but it was wrong nonetheless. So you need to empirically test what you are seeing. So the first thing that you need to ask yourself is, where in the string of influences from do you want to insert your evaluative probe? Where do you want to make your observations? So if you're following the InTeGrate model, you will be you'll have a group of materials developers, and you could look at how those materials developers have changed their attitudes or their approaches. Those materials developers create instructional materials. You could look at the materials themselves. How well do they align with the goals of your project? Those in the InTeGrate model, those materials are not used directly by students, but rather are implemented by instructors. So you could look at the instructors and look at their behavior or their practices. And then finally, you could look at the students themselves. And you could evaluate anywhere along that string of influences. InTeGrate looked in all those boxes. You will probably be developing a smaller project, so you'll have to make hard decisions about where you want to look. You can't look everywhere. Likewise, you'll need to think about, what's your motivation? Why are you collecting this data in the first place? Is your motivation to get insights that will help you improve your project and the products while the project is going along? That would be called formative evaluation. And the example that Anne showed, where the first cohort and second cohort of materials were not doing well on systems thinking and metacognition. And that data was used as the project progressed to improve the process and the products. Or is your goal to persuade external stakeholders, for example, funders or potential users, that your materials are doing what you wanted them to do? Or are you engaged in education research? Is your goal to create fundamental knowledge about teaching or learning or thinking that extends beyond your specific finite project? And again, InTeGrate did all of those things, but you'll need to be more strategic about what you want to do. Whichever level you're looking at, as you think about where to look along this continuum, the fact is that the signal gets weaker and weaker as you go down this chain of influences. So you would be basically inserting your intervention at the upstream end by gathering a group of materials developers and creating a set of instructional materials. But as that information, as that influence flows then into the instructors, and then from the instructors to the students, the signal gets weaker and weaker. And I'll tell you that InTeGrate was multiple years into our materials development process, and was at N or number of students tested in the thousands before we began to detect reliable pre-post changes at the level of student knowledge, student understanding, and student attitudes. So you've got to think carefully if that's where you're going to look. On the other hand, as you go along that chain of influences, it also gets to be more consequential. After all, the reason we're doing this is because we want students to know more, to understand more, to care more about the Earth, to change the way they act towards the Earth. And so if you your intervention is not reaching all the way to the students effectively and in a way that you can document, well, you've missed out on the most consequential place to be looking. Where you decide on this chain of influences to look will decide how you're going to look. So let's just look at each possibility. And as I said, InTeGrate looked in all these places, and InTeGrate has left you a heritage of a set of tools and processes and structures that you could use wherever along here you want to work. So let's say you want to look at the materials developers. The InTeGrate leadership was absolutely convinced that participating in this collaborative, interdisciplinary, shared co-construction of materials would be or could potentially be a life-changing experience for the materials developers. And so InTeGrate put a fair amount of effort into probing, first of all, documenting what their expertise and background was, documenting their attitudes, what they did, how they thought about it, through a series of written reflections, through surveys, and through interviews. Or you might choose to look at the materials themselves So what to look at? First would be conformity to guidelines. So a set of guidelines similar to the rubric. You could also look at use of best practices, which you could define as certain research-based practices that you believe in. You could also look at breadth and depth of coverage, and second set of comments will show how InTeGrate did some of that. InTeGrate has provided some tools that you could use, the materials development rubric, obviously, but also if you're interested in next generation science standards, there's a protocol for tagging instructional materials that InTeGrate developed, and then there's some other kinds of things that are specific to specific things that you might want to document about the breadth or scope or nature of the materials that your project has created. You could also look at the instructors. You could look at their attitudes and beliefs. You could look at their teaching practices. InTeGrate did both of those. You could also look at fidelity of implementation. That's how accurately or how much the enacted curriculum resembled the written curriculum. InTeGrate did not study that. You can probe that through instructor stories. InTeGrate has more than 100 instructor stories posted. Classroom observations, again, a survey or interview. And InTeGrate found a lot of existing tools for this aspect of our work. So there's a alphabet soup here of RTOP for classroom observations, different kinds of teacher belief inventories, beliefs about reform science, and you can find links to all of these documents if you follow the link from the webinar page that points to assessment and evaluation. And then finally, there's the National Survey of Geoscience Faculty put up by NIGT, and InTeGrate was able to identify which respondents to the NAGT survey had been involved in InTeGrate at different levels. So that's another methodology. InTeGrate also developed some specific interview tools that could be made available. And then finally, for probing what your students have learned, this is what's most familiar to us as faculty. We're used to writing exams. We're used to writing student activities that have a product that can be evaluated, looking for knowledge or understanding. Perhaps less familiar is looking at students' attitudes or beliefs. So that would be their attitudes towards concern about environmental problems, their attitudes or enthusiasm about careers that involve they're using their knowledge about the earth, and also their actions. For example, their actions with respect to sustainability behaviors like recycling or using public transportation, or their intended actions such as their intention to seek out a career where they'll use their knowledge of the earth or environment. So what's most familiar, so how to probe that? So your most fundamental decision is whether or not you're going to be using student products that are specific to the taught content. So those would be the kinds of things that you're used to creating for exams and student activities in the courses that you teach. Or are there wider learning goals that would be appropriately taught by, assessed by some kind of externally designed assessment? So InTeGrate had some assessments that were used across the entire project, across all those different materials, covering all those different topics, aimed at trying to understand to what extent the guiding principles, things like use of systems thinking, interdisciplinary problem solving, and addressing grand challenges of sustainability were being assessed. So do you want your assessment just to exactly match the things that you taught, or do you want a broader assessment that will span across different content domains? And InTeGrate offers some tools that are available for your use. The Geoscience Literacy Exam is a test for short answers, test for knowledge and understanding about big ideas in solid earth sciences, atmospheric sciences, ocean sciences, and climate sciences. There's the InTeGrate Attitudinal Instrument, an online survey developed by InTeGrate, which probes students' enthusiasm about careers and majors related to the earth, their desire to participate in solving grand challenges related to environmental degradation and sustainability. InTeGrate also had 2 project-wide essay questions, one on systems thinking, one on interdisciplinary problem solving. So for all of those, there is a a comparison database of answers provided by students who were participants in the InTeGrate project, which you might use as a comparison group. And equally important, although maybe less obvious, is that InTeGrate developed an infrastructure for gathering data from campuses across the country, anonymizing the student data, setting up infrastructure for collaborative scoring of anonymized student short essay answers, and archiving the data. So some of which could potentially be repurposed for one of your projects. So I have just a few overarching suggestions if you are plunging into this business of organizing a materials development project and you want to know how it's working. The first is plan in advance. Define success. What do we hope to see, or what do we hope to answer? And also, what kind of comparison are you going to be making? Presumably, you want to say that you're better than the way it used to be done, or that you're better than some other group. So better than what? When you are in the implementation phase, if you haven't done this kind of work before, you will find yourself involved in the institutional review board of your institution and seeking informed consent from your students. InTeGrate struggled with getting a low response rate from students, and we ended up putting a lot of effort into that. The InTeGrate staff have some suggestions about how to make that work. Anonymizing the data will be something you'll probably won't wanting to worry about. And also, this is all extremely labor intensive, especially as soon as you get into non-short answers where you're scoring essays and keeping track of all these large amounts of data. So document as you go along. I am at the stage of crossing the final T's and dotting the final I's on the final evaluation report. And although I thought I was documenting as I go along, I sure wish that I knew where some of those files are. So document as you go along. And then finally, enjoy the data. If you are a data lover in your work as a geoscientist, you can be a data lover for this new kind of data as well. It's full of interesting stories, full of interesting twists and turns, and have a great time. More questions? Let's see. I need to get back to where I can see the chat.
Okay,
Why don't you answer chat for a moment?
I'll take over sharing.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Now I can see the chat. Okay. Let's see. I'm relatively new and excited about this resource. If I were to share it with others who are target users for broader dissemination. I
answered that in the chat, but you should go ahead and add.
Oh, okay. No, let me get down to ones that are, I see, need to call the target audience was undergraduate students. However, we've also been using them at high school and beyond. One of the things that I mean, again, I don't want to speak for the organizers of the upcoming workshop, but one of the things that I hope would be coming out of the upcoming workshop would be people coming to learn to use InTeGrate's tools and lesson learns and materials to reach a broader audience. So InTeGrate was, strictly United States. There's the whole rest of the world where other planet, every inhabitant of the planet should be getting a better Earth education. There's informal education, there's continuing education, there's a lot of additional directions that one could go other than just undergraduates. Within undergraduates, though, I think InTeGrate was notable for reaching way outside of geoscience departments. So that might not have been obvious, but these materials were used in Spanish classes, in literature classes, in economics classes, across a very wide range. So our traditional approach of let's teach great stuff in our geology departments and the students will come to us. That work that used to work for a while, but truly this is a form of education that needs to reach every person who lives on the planet. And so InTeGrate made a really, really strong effort to reach people who would not normally show up in a geoscience department class, to go where the students were rather than waiting for the students to come to us. Do you have any issues with students resisting the sustainability issue, which may seem linked to a contentious topic of climate change? Or did it seem somehow hidden, for lack of better words, in the umbrella of the science? That is a really, really interesting question. I was the external evaluator. I was not in the classroom with these materials. So other people might have, other people who are on the call might have personal experience that they would like to put into the chat. So I'd love to hear. However, I can say that I did spend a lot of time looking at the data from the InTeGrate attitudinal instrument, which did have the capacity to pick up people who were not at all impressed with the sustainability message. And I would say that there was always a tail, a distinctly non-zero tail of people always at the very, very far end of the non-sustainability distribution of whatever question we asked. In general, the attitudinal data tended to be skewed towards pretty pro-environment or pro-sustainable, but there was always a tail, and the tail went all the way to the far end of the non-sustainable answers. What else can we expect at the upcoming meeting? We're not, Anne and I are not running the meeting. Rory made a few comments on that at the beginning. There's a good website that has quite a bit of detail about what's going to happen at the upcoming meeting. So I guess I would refer you to that. So, okay, I think we're at the end of our questions. Do you want to go on, Anne?
Sure, I will take it. I want to echo a couple things that Kim just said. She ended with one of my favorite phrases of enjoy the data. And I think one of the realizations we came to during probably in the middle of this project was, oh my gosh, we have a lot of data. So, making decisions, as she said, was really important. And we made some decisions that could have gone another way in terms of what we were able to look at. But these projects do generate an enormous amount of data, and there's many questions you could ask. And yes, I was going to invite also the authors. I know there are a few on the call, so if you have any comments, please definitely add them in the chat. And I think that was Cynthia Fadham, maybe, who just made a comment about climate change. She was in part of the first cohort. I know there are a couple authors from that one on the call here. Ah, great. So I will say, she says that they took an adaptation approach and stuck to authentic data as a way to get away from the blame game and stay focused on the science. We were coming from a science perspective, so that was definitely an emphasis in the materials, and using authentic geoscience data was one of those guiding principles. So that was had to be explicit and pervasive throughout, even if they were being used in literature or Spanish classes. So that is something to keep in mind. I think there's a lot of also literature about how just the data isn't necessarily going to change anyone's mind. So anyway, if there are any other authors who want to make comments, please feel free to add anything in the chat. And we just have a couple more slides. I did want to give you a sense for the scope of the materials. There are many, many ways to look at the scope of what we developed, and I'm going to show you this one and mention a few others. These are every 4 years, the American Geosciences Institute publishes this document that is meant to be part of the related to a new president coming into office. So this is AGI's critical needs for geoscience in the future, and this was the 2016 publication. And so we just, we didn't use this as a guiding principle in developing the materials, but we did use it as a way to see if how well we were matched to what another organization was viewing as the critical connections between geoscience and society. So you can see that distribution. There's a somewhat complicated color scheme associated with it. modules are smaller than courses. That's about the biggest distinction between them, but otherwise they all are consistent in having passed the rubric and being quite substantial materials. And then we divided them into introductory, sort of intermediate, and advanced, so you can see how those go across the spectrum. So we covered everything, but not, or all of their critical needs, but not all of them as deeply as others. So you can see some potential needs there. We also looked at these in terms of their alignment with the next generation science standards. Some of you are familiar with that. That would be more connections to what's going on in the high school classroom. And we have a similar scope of covering lots of what's there, not everything in the NGSS, but there are some very strong, of course, we're strongest in things like natural hazards, water resources, etc. There's another question that's come up for Kim. I'm going to go through just, yeah, so there are lots of other ways to consider the scope. I'm going to finish my comments here, and then I'll turn it back to Kim, and she can answer some of those questions as well. So here's what I see as some gaps and thin spots, and I'll say this is my opinion, and possibly I think Kim's opinion is in there as well. So within audiences, you know, we did not do as well reaching sort of upper level disciplinary science courses, even in the geosciences. So, you know, things like structural geology or sedimentology, we didn't have anything developed in that area, or in really anything beyond intro, say, biology. So that's a gap or a thin spot. K-12, I think we're starting to see how we can apply these materials at the K-12 level, but they're not necessarily designed with that in mind. So there's a lot of adaptation to be done. As Kim mentioned, there's also this whole world out there of informal education where certainly bits and pieces of this could be used, but that was not the audience we were developing for. Graduate education, international, there's many other audiences to reach besides American undergraduates. Within topics, I think we have a lot covering energy resources and water resources, but not non-energy, non-water resources, like what in the AGI is listed as raw materials. In terms of what are the geoscience topics that are in all introductory courses, we didn't get any, we don't have very many of the sort of solid earth, the Earth's interior, mountain building, those kinds of materials, deep time. And in terms of approaches, and I would say this is, again, my opinion, really supporting, and this came out of aligning the materials with the NGSS. We don't have a lot in supporting students doing their own investigations. We have a lot of really data-rich materials where the data is being collected from the web or gathered from websites, but not necessarily a lot of that develop your own investigation. I think we could do more with helping instructors connect their students to the local communities. And then I also said border and boundary crossing. And while I think we did a lot to cross disciplinary boundaries, I think we didn't do as much to cross international or, especially some of these sustainability and environmental issues that naturally cross borders. So those are some of the approaches, audiences, topics, and approaches that I see we could, that are gaps and thin spots.
Okay, so I should go back to this question. Going back to the GLE and the Geoscience Literacy Exam and the InTeGrate attitudinal instrument I'm reading now from the chat. Do institutions mostly use them internally, pre and post testing, or are they national norms now that the instruments are widely used? So they were used by the InTeGrate project, and the data was collected centrally and pooled across the whole project. The information was also available to the individual curriculum developers to use in improving their material and revising their materials as they went along. So there is now a data set that one could compare with. It's not easily set up to do that. That would take some further work to do that. There was an effort to do that with InTeGrate, with the IAI, about midway through the project, but that comparison data set is now not the largest possible data set. And I should also say that although it's a national data set, it's not a random data set or a purposeful data set. It's not the data set that you would have gone forth to collect if you were trying to collect the data set whose main purpose would be to be a national comparison data set. But nonetheless, there is comparison data set against which you can collect. You're not starting with cell A1 of your spreadsheet with no comparison. So I'm now going to take back the share. And
there were a couple more questions, if you don't mind. While you take back the share, go ahead and do that, and I'll just answer the two questions that came in. So one was about crossing cultural boundaries, borders, and that also I think would be great. We do have some materials that considered other perspectives and other cultures and backgrounds. But I would say that it's not a complete gap. I would say it's a thin spot. And then Hannah asked, how much of the lack of student-driven investigations do you think are due to the time frame of the modules? Because they are scaled to fit as just a portion of a class. And so that's a good question. In some of the more advanced materials where the students are at a higher level and they're more for majors or whatever, there are more student-driven investigations at that level. So it's not necessarily more time. I think it's either more time or more expertise of the students, because in some cases the modules went over, weren't 3 consecutive weeks, say, but were beginning, middle, and end of a course. So that's a way that they appear. And it was also, some do have more student-driven investigation. So again, I would say it's not a complete gap. It's thin, and I think for transitioning into more NGSS-driven materials, or in the K-12 realm, or at the intro level, that is where it's thinnest, that we could definitely use some more student-driven investigations there.
That sounds exciting. That sounds great. So my last comments are just basically some overarching reflections on why I think InTeGrate worked as well as it did. And this is kind of a few highlights from the last chapter of the evaluation report, which is linked from the webinar webpage if you want to hear more about any of these things. So the first point, I think, is that InTeGrate gained a tremendous amount of energy from the conviction amongst many of the key players that humanity is facing a profound environmental crisis, and that Earth education can be part of the solution. So InTeGrate asked a lot of its participants, a lot of time, a lot of energy, a lot of creativity. And I think many people were willing to go the extra mile and just keep on going, way beyond what they were getting paid for, but just because they thought that this was so important and that Earth education could be part of the solution. And you too can tap into that energy, and I encourage you to do so. InTeGrate went where the students are. I already talked about that. InTeGrate didn't wait for students to show up in the geology department classrooms. InTeGrate went where the students were. And that included, in addition to what we've already mentioned, that included reaching out to institutions of higher education where there were no geoscience faculty, or maybe only one geoscience faculty, no geoscience departments, and other directions. InTeGrate placed great faith in the capacity and motivation of college faculty. So, these teams of college faculty didn't have any training in pedagogy. They were just pulled together from different disciplines and put into this structure. But there was a lot of faith in how much they could do if properly supported and properly encouraged and with the right scaffolding. However, InTeGrate combined accountability with support and recognition. So you heard all about the system of checkpoints, the assessment team member that was deployed to work with each instructional materials team, and so forth. But then lots of support to help the teams do it better, and then recognition in the form of opportunities to publish, a letter to your dean, and so forth for success. In addition to all those faculty, InTeGrate's success really relied on very talented and hardworking professional staff. The technical staff were amazing. They built a whole bunch of purpose-built tools specifically for the use of the materials developers and the other components of the program. And the web, they're called the web assistants, but basically they oversaw the process of moving the materials into a publicly usable form. They were fabulous. InTeGrate was designed and implemented using systems thinking. Kathy Manduka and I have a paper on this if you're interested in looking into it further. But that meant that, for example, InTeGrate expected in its planning that one intervention would lead to another impact, which would lead to another impact, and which would lead to another impact, and that one action could potentially result in multiple beneficial outcomes, and that one desired outcome could be nudged by multiple causative influences. And that was specifically planned from the beginning, and we encourage you to try that. InTeGrate consciously planned to leave lasting traces on the landscape of higher education. So InTeGrate adopted the metaphor of a climatic event or orogenic event where traces were left behind in the form of mountain ranges and metamorphic rocks long after the initial impetus was gone. So long after the money dried up, the intent was that InTeGrate's not just materials, but changed people who had been changed by their contact with this project would carry forward their ideas on into the future. And finally, not everything worked. And InTeGrate built a learning organization that could notice and acknowledge when something wasn't working, and find the lessons learned, find a way to do it better, and go forward. So the examples that you saw early in the talk about systems thinking really wasn't working at the beginning, and InTeGrate was learned from that lesson and put in place a module and professional development and a whole other bunch of things, but it didn't work the first time. So InTeGrate learned from failed attempts. So it's been a great project to work on, and I look forward to hearing what you guys are going to build on top of it. Another opportunity for questions. And once again, I have to get back to the place where I can see the questions. Here we go.
Yeah, I've been responding to a few in the chat. There's been
good.
There's been a lot of good comments from authors about both their modules and the process. Elizabeth Naj recommended looking more at the IAI that Kim talked about, and both she and I have used some or all of that in other types of evaluations as well. There's some good questions there. And Cynthia and Hannah both talked about some of the work they've done in their own modules. And Satoshi asked about the connection with what I meant by the connection with local community. And so I typed an answer there, but just to elaborate a little bit, I'm thinking more along the lines of service learning type projects where classes and students are working with communities on issues that communities care about and need help with, and not just getting out into the field or just seeing what's out there, but actually engaging in the science to help communities. Any other questions?
Someone's asked if InTeGrate did work with National Geographic, and I'm not aware of that connection, if there was such a connection. I don't know about it.
No, I'm not either, and I haven't heard of the geo inquiry process, but please, that was from Lori. If you feel free to type that in the, or if there's a link you can share with us, that would be great. And Hannah just added that Wittenberg did some community engaged work in their implementation program. So that would be a good example to look at. The other webinar a few weeks ago was about results from the implementation programs.
I have two people in the room here with me. Do either of you want to ask a question? So, okay. Okay.
Well, thanks very much, everyone.
We look forward to seeing you at Carleton in a few weeks. Many of you, not quite all of you.
Thank you.
Are you taking over?
Yeah,
Or,
I can take over.
sorry.
Thanks, Kim and Ann, and thank you to our audience for participating today. As always, we appreciate your feedback and ideas for future, well, maybe not future webinars. This is probably the last one, but we do still appreciate your feedback, and we'd encourage you to fill out the webinar evaluation, which I'll enter into the chat shortly. We also encourage you to continue the discussion, and we have an online community discussion board, which you can participate in if you so choose. As part of the NNGT webinar series, we have more events coming up this semester. Our next webinar on Thursday, October 10th is operationalizing the Earth Science Week theme in K-12, Geosciences for Everyone. We'd encourage you to register for that webinar and join us then. You can also consider your department program or course for NAGT's Traveling Workshops program. Our next deadline for those applications is October 15th, I believe. And join us at the 2020 Earth Educators Rendezvous next summer, which will be held in Palo Alto, California. And thanks again, everyone.